Hello everyone. For anyone that doesn't know me, which is most of you since I just started a new channel, I'm a Brazilian socialist, and the other day I found an interestingly titled video by the American right-wing YouTube channel called PragerU. It's interesting to me because it implies that socialism ruined Brazil. The statement alone raises a few interesting questions. Now, PragerU is funded by American billionaires, so it's safe to assume that they have a vested interest in making people not like socialism. Even so, let's see what they have to say about whether Brazil was socialist, and if so, how socialism ruined Brazil.
Many American millennials seem to be drawn to socialism. They came out in big numbers for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 presidential primaries.
Now, I know the video has just actually started, but I'd like to point out an important theme here. He seems to consider Bernie Sanders and his wide base of support to be socialist, and then goes on to use the supposed failure of, quote, socialism in Brazil as a warning to Sanders and his supporters. The cognitive dissonance here is that while the right wing commonly says that the Nordic social democracies are capitalist, which I agree with, they then say that social democracies in the imperial periphery are not capitalist and are instead fully socialist, to justify the claims that it is socialism that drove certain third world countries into poverty. In short, even though welfare states in the imperial core and the imperial periphery are both capitalist, the right wing will claim that the wealthy countries who practice social democracy are free market capitalist utopias, while the miserable state of poor countries who practice or practiced social democracy is due to socialism. The exact same policies, free healthcare, free college, social programs, welfare, are branded by the right wing as either capitalism or socialism, depending on whether the country in question is poor, so they can blame the very wealthy or very poor state of that country on either the amazing efficiency of capitalism in the free market or the terrible failure of socialism, respectively.
They rail against capitalism on their college campuses. They wear Che Guevara t-shirts to signal their socialist virtue. I know a lot about socialism. I live in Rio de Janeiro, and I work throughout Brazil as a journalist for a popular magazine. In the early 2000s, Brazil's economy was growing rapidly. The government had enacted economic and monetary reforms and divested holdings in some state-run companies, giving the private sector more room to breathe. Inflation, a chronic problem in Brazil, was dramatically reduced. Foreign investors poured into the country, eager to catch a portion of our expanding economy.
I would point out that the y-axis on this graph is not labeled, so we have no idea what this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% is. But I know that is a very common thing to see on PragerU, so maybe my standards are a bit too high. What do they want us to think? It is some vague concept of growth or economic goodness of some kind? Well, anyways, we come to the question, what were those reforms he mentioned, and did the future really seem very promising? By this, he is probably referring to the economic policies of Brazilian president from 1995 to 2003, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Cardoso is part of the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, which by the time he assumed office had shifted to the right to the point where they were no longer social democrats but were rather neoliberals. They just kept the name. He privatized various enterprises and decreased spending on behalf of the federal government. And however, these liberal measures came with a need for increased domestic demand, of course, and for that he increased the minimum wage by around 44%. And there's also one other thing about this period that PragerU doesn't really tell you about in this video. It's that we were in the midst of adopting a new currency. Yeah, that's kind of significant, and they didn't really say a single word about that. Before a new currency, we consistently had rates of inflation anywhere from 200% to 2000% per year in Brazil, regardless of whether the government in power was neoliberal. This includes the US-backed military dictators or social democratic. So no, you don't really get to start your video by saying it was the private sector that was guiding Brazil to prosperity until socialism had to come and ruin everything.
The future seemed promising. But today, our economy is in shambles, unemployment and debt are massive, and powerful politicians are being investigated for involvement in the largest scandals of fraud and corruption in the country's history. What happened? In 2002, a socialist politician named Lula da Silva ran for the presidency. He was a socialist, but painted himself as a modern, cool kind of socialist.
Again, we have from this video what can only be described as frankly intellectual dishonesty. PragerU is making this video for an audience of mostly American viewers who don't know much about Brazilian politics, and authoritatively says twice that Lula was a socialist. What they don't say is that Lula did not mention socialism in either of his campaigns, once, at least not a single time that got enough media coverage to appear on any of Google's 10 first result pages. This, of course, is reflected in the policies that Lula enacted during his presidency: social programs, welfare, and general redistributionism. Nothing he did challenged the foundations of capitalism in Brazil, because he didn't want to. He didn't want to democratize production as well as the workplace by means of abolishing private property, because he was not a socialist, he was a social democrat. He wanted to create a less brutal version of capitalism by redistributing wealth through taxes, not change the working class's relation to the means of production. But we know that since Brazil is poor, PragerU isn't going to use the real definition of socialism. They're going to use socialism as when the government does stuff. And as socialists, we know why social democracy eventually fails, especially in the global south. And it's generally because most countries that try it can't imperialize other countries to fund the welfare state, as well as pressure from the national and international bourgeoisie to roll back reforms, which is something we'll see in the next few minutes when he goes on to talk about the collapse of Lula's supposed socialism during his successor's presidency.
He would be the politician who would heal national divisions and unite everyone. He even had a nickname, Lulinha Paz e Amor, which means Little Lula Peace and Love in Portuguese. But the old message about the need for income redistribution to decrease inequality was still there. The media, academic elite, and celebrities assured Brazilians that by transferring the money from the rich to the poor could finally be richer. But the only ones who really got rich were Lula and his corporate and political friends.
Again, we have this video butchering the definition of socialism. They cut out socialism as, again, some concept of redistributionism, which was purportedly supported by famous people and intellectuals. They then go on to say that the only people that got rich from Lula's policies were him and his friends. This is probably referring to the many corruption scandals which Lula was and still is involved in. I'm not going to give an opinion on that since it doesn't relate to Lula's economic redistributive policies. That said, the way this video phrases that implies that Lula's economics themselves helped no working class Brazilians. Even as a person who is to the left of Lula, as I believe in socialism rather than redistribution and social democracy, I must say that is simply false. Lula's policies, frankly, did improve the lives of millions. We can see that during the Lula years, the percentage of the population living in poverty dropped from around 36% in 2003 to 18.4% in 2011. And the percentage of extreme poverty within the national population dropped by almost 2/3 from 15.2% to 6.3%. You can't really say that the only people that benefited from social democracy in Brazil were Lula and his cronies.
It only got worse under his successor, Dilma Rousseff. The socialists increased government spending, deficits, and debt. They called it a stimulus. They increased the minimum wage and the benefits of social programs. They call it social justice. They increased the salaries and retirement benefits of the civil service. They called it investing in the future. They handed out thousands of jobs in the government and state-owned companies as favors to their political allies. And they called it good governance. It worked for a while. Socialism always works at the beginning. But government spending just kept going up, and then Lula's socialist paradise fell apart and the economy fell with it. The outcome? From 2008 to 2015, government spending grew nearly 4 times as fast as tax revenue. The economy shrank 3.8% in 2015, the worst result in 25 years. That same year, a World Bank survey found Brazil's economy to be one of the world's worst.
Now, this is probably the most ridiculous and misleading thing this video has stated so far. They started out by mentioning Lula's social democratic policies, calling them socialism, and immediately they say that, quote, big government and helping poor people was somehow the cause of Brazil's economy suddenly falling apart in 2014. No serious Brazilian talking about Brazilian economics to a Brazilian audience would make this claim. It's a consensus in Brazil that around 30% of the 2014 crisis was caused by falling commodity prices abroad, leading to a drop in revenue from exports to China. As for the rest, it's agreed upon, even by the right, that the crisis wasn't the fault of Lula's social programs. It was caused mainly by Dilma's new economic plan that was meant to appease the corporations, saying that redistribution and a high minimum wage, even though they increased domestic demand and thus reduced dependence on exports, were, quote, unsustainable and put too much pressure on national industry. So Dilma launched the infamous Nova Matriz Econômica, translating to New Economic Matrix, a plan to develop domestic industry whose most significant parts were subsidies and tax breaks. Yes, subsidies and tax breaks. Years after she was impeached for other reasons, Dilma herself said, "My biggest mistake was to give the tax breaks. I thought that if I cut taxes, they would invest more in industry. Instead, they broadened their profit margins." Of course, there were other things in the plan that contributed to the crisis, but you cannot say that it was poor people getting programs and services that caused 2014. If you're a socialist, you can easily explain that this demonstrates why social democracy is unsustainable, as it was policy that led to the crisis was pushed for by corporate interests that remain powerful even after redistributive policies. But if you're a neoliberal, this does seem like an indictment of your own economics.
Out of 189 countries, we were the 16th hardest place to open a business, the 60th most difficult nation in which to register property, and the 12th most complex place to pay taxes. Economically and morally, the almost 15 years of socialist policies have greatly harmed Brazil. We also remain among the world's leaders in murder and robbery, and we rank near the bottom of industrialized nations in terms of education and healthcare.
Could we maybe invest more in those? Oh no, I guess that would be big government, wouldn't it?
Americans take it for granted that they can be born into the lower class and reach the middle or even upper class. Many Brazilians take it for granted that they can't. But finally, some things are starting to change. There may be reason for hope. Today, more and more Brazilians see that capitalism and limited government are the only way forward.
Is that true? This video was filmed in 2017, so I bet they couldn't have predicted that in the following year Brazil would elect a culturally fascist and economically liberal president who would later have his approval rating plummet because his free market laissez-faire policies led to a disastrous handling of a national emergency. I wonder if that could happen.
Thankfully for Brazil, Lula has been charged in several lawsuits for corruption, involvement in a criminal organization, influence peddling, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Rousseff was impeached in 2016 for falsifying the government's finances and illegally using money from state-owned banks to run the government. This crisis prompted the new government to freeze federal spending, reduce the government's role in state-owned companies, and to encourage some of the massive federal workforce to resign. No one knows whether these basic measures will be enough to rescue Brazil economically. Truthfully, the damage has been so extensive it may take decades for the country to recover. But if we do, it won't be socialism that saves us. American millennials, take note. I am Felipe Moura Brasil for Prager University.
I know it will not be liberalism nor social democracy that saves us, that's for sure. If anything, the history of capitalism in Brazil ever since the semi-feudal First Republic to the US-implanted military dictatorships to the crises of 2014 and 2020 is in its entirety a desperate call for socialism on behalf of the working class and the global south. And now I think we've covered pretty much the entire video. With that, I feel the need to thank anyone who watched this video to the end, as it is my first video that I make on this channel, and I imagine naturally not many people will. And obviously the video itself could have been a lot better since I really don't have any YouTube experience at all. Anyways, if you want to support me and thought this was informative in any way, consider subscribing so you'll be one of the very few people to know when I make a new video, probably in a week or two. So I will see you in the next one.